know that we all speak the Italian language, but we'll switch to English. Here we go. We are recording, I think. All right, so let's go a bit on inequality. We introduced the topic the other day. Was that Tuesday? Tuesday, yes, today is Thursday. Sorry, I'm losing a bit the notions of which day of the week we are. And so a natural way to look at inequality is to look at where it comes from. And there's no doubt that it comes from the fact that people are heterogeneous. We made some jokes, but they were not only jokes. At the end of the class the other day, pointing out that if people were very homogeneous, in fact identical, there would be no economics. And certainly there would be no inequality. Okay, and the heterogeneity leads to various forms of power and property, and different forms of power and property seem to lead to inequality. Where inequality is meant in common parlance, and this is, I think, one problem. So the topic is extremely delicate, and in some sense, the topic is very sensitive. Talking explicitly and clearly about inequality has become a bit taboo. So we'll try to make an effort, but I don't promise being successful. In any case, the topic is given in the following form. Inequality is bad and should be overcome. That's typically the way we have addressed it. And quite honestly, we tend to share this view. So one observation, which is certainly relevant and on which research has developed in the last decades, but mostly outside economics, I would say among psychologists, social psychologists, or evolutionary psychologists, is the almost spontaneous rejection that most human beings have in most culture, or fastidiousness toward, let's call it status inequality, not just economic inequality. You have bigger wealth and more consumption good, a better house, a better car, better clothes, or you live a more consumption-oriented life than me, but in terms of status, authority, popularity, right to do things or not to do things. Okay, there is a tendency not to like that very much, and so probably there is some form of selected, evolved, instinctive rejection of inequality, of certain form of inequality. I would call them outcome inequality. Now, this is not general, though. So one observation that I've kept making, because very few researchers have made it, and I think it teaches us quite a bit, and in fact, I would like to have the ability and the time to go back to it in a more systematic way, is the following. While we feel that certain kind of outcome inequality are unfair or should be overcome, there are others that we admire. There are others we admire. So we often say that the financier XYZ makes X million, 3 million, 10 million a year, is somewhat unfair. But we do admire Cristiano Ronaldo. We even admire Usain Bolt, even in the sense he makes less money than Cristiano Ronaldo. Or we admire, well, I don't want to make names here because I know tastes change, but I would say on average, Italians right now think the Maneskin are the end of the world and the beginning as well. And they admire them. So there is a set of outcome inequality that we actually not only accept, but we deem valuable. And the form of envy we may or may not feel toward these people is a mild envy. In fact, it's such a mild envy that most people rush to get their autograph or take a picture with them or shake their hands or pat them on the back when they meet them. Okay? Whereas we don't have the same reaction for the neurosurgeon, or let's put it down at a lower level, for the plastic surgeon that makes $3 million or 5 million euros a year by breast implants, hips, lips, and other cutting on human faces and bodies. Okay. So I put that as a question, you know, what kind of inequality we like, what kind of inequality we don't like, and what motivates our disliking of inequality that we really do dislike. There is no doubt. So one has to be. I have an interpretation of this. If next week when we'll do a question section, we can go through it. I will not. I'm not going to spend time on my hypothesis of why this is so. So when we ask if inequality is unavoidable, we are actually asking about a subset of inequalities. And interestingly enough, we've been changing over time what these inequalities should be. And for a variety of reasons. I don't want to question the reason nor the choice of which inequalities we think should be reduced, which other instead we accept. But I'm just pointing out that what we now believe to be not efficient, not just, not appropriate, not acceptable inequality is different from what we believed even only 40 years ago. Think about schooling, for example. In schooling, there is a widespread view that, and it's growing, that we should adjust testing of any kind, or either eliminate it altogether, or adjust it in such a way that everybody roughly gets the same grade. That is, with people that have this or the other slowness in learning, or are this or the other certified weakness in learning, get more support, so that when the test comes, they get the same grade, or they have the same chances as the other people to get the same grade. Notice that we don't do this in basketball. So we don't ask for basketballs where when I have to dunk, the basketball goes down. And when Michael Jordan has to dunk, it goes back up. Okay, but we do ask to do that when it comes to, say, examinations of various kinds, and so on. So even the notion of what's a good inequality or a bad inequality, an inequality that should be overcome or reduced, and which one should not, is being modified over time. It seems clear that a large chunk of inequalities, therefore, are unavoidable. In fact, we even like them. We would never want to eliminate the inequalities that make all kinds of sport activities interesting. Right? Imagine any sport where, and I now saw Filippo message about the exams. Imagine any sport where we managed to eliminate inequality. That would be incredibly boring. It would disappear, right? Or now imagine any artistic performance of any kind where we manage to eliminate inequality. I don't know how we can do it, but I suppose we can do it by asking a good singer to sing poorly, or filtering the singing of poor singers, or things like that. So there is a whole set of inequalities we never will want to eliminate, because eliminating them will spoil the fun. One says, oh, those are natural inequality. It's economic inequality that is not natural. It's economic inequality that depends on social institution, on rules, and therefore it should be eliminated. Well, I'm not sure that's correct if you think of it historically, because obviously in basketball or in soccer or in tennis, the inequality follows from the rules. If tennis amounted to standing still in front of the net at about a meter apart and passing the ball to each other, I'll probably have some chance against Nadal. So it's obviously the rules that may create inequality. In fact, the rules are created to foster inequality and chances and altering the chances of different individuals. Not only, lots of this performance inequality induces income inequality. So we might want to say, well, yeah, fine. There is no reason to modify the rules of tennis to make everybody equal. So let's leave the rules of tennis as they are. So the guys that play better will be applauded, they will win the game, and the game will be interesting to watch. But let's take away the economic inequality this brings about. Let's just leave the status. We just applaud, like it used to be the case in the Olympic Games, right? That the athletes would do it for free. They would just do it for the so-called glory, for the pleasure of arriving first, and not for monetary compensation. Now, this is not true for anybody. As soon as it has become possible to compensate athletes economically, we've done so. And in fact, doing so, we are convinced, has made the whole thing more spectacular, more interesting, has attracted more people. We would never back off from this habit. But it didn't used to be so. Okay? All right. So that's another problem, right? Because if I say, let's take away the economic inequality from sport or singing or opera, art, think of the arts. Why is that the famous artist has become so rich? So you paint something, it's beautiful, or it's considered beautiful. You do it to express yourself. It's a form of human and artistic expression. And then you want millions to make that art available to others. Why is that so? But nevertheless, we actually think that that should be there. So we don't like inequality only in certain instances. I would say we don't like inequality in anything that has to do, not with markets, but has to do with, I don't know. I actually do not know which inequality we like, which inequality we don't like. Because when I put together the world of sports, the world of entertainment, the world of art, of all form of art, from cinema to theater to book writing to, if you want to add to art also CV, all form of, I get a big share of GMP. No? I get a lot of workers. In some instances, they can put in science. Some scientists have become fairly wealthy or fairly well off by pursuing their research, and that also we accept. I mean, nobody thinks it's wrong that Giorgio Parisi got about €500,000 this year because of his work, his research. Now, €500,000 doesn't make you as rich as Bezos, but, you know, it takes the average guy about, 20 years to earn €500,000 net. So now Giorgio Parisi's speaking engagement will be paid $50,000 a piece. That's a lot more than the average guy makes in a year of work. I mean, I'm not blaming Giorgio Parisi, make it clear. Krugman charges 4 times as much for a speech and a dinner and a first-class ticket. Point is that that's a kind of inequality we're willing to accept. So there is a very large set of inequalities we're willing to accept, very large, and another set we're not. How did economists look at this? Well, you know, there is a widespread belief in popular press, and some colleagues like to push it as if it were true, that the classical economists were concerned about inequality. That's what they discussed, because they, and we have seen it also in this class when we talked about prices and value and so on, you know, at the beginning, the classical paid a lot of attention to what's called income distribution. But if you read them, they care absolutely little about income inequality. What they care about was how national income, how value added, how the value of commerce gets shared among social classes that they identify with the providers of different inputs, different type of contribution. Land, capital, entrepreneur, labor, managerial labor later on, pure simple labor at the beginning. And if you read them with a bit of care instead of reading them with ideological eyes, most of the so-called classical did that because they wanted to legitimate market prices as a way of distributing income, as opposed to medieval feudalitarian or, in general, autocratic rules. Their point was that. Their point was, look, when you let the market for labor, market for goods, market for land work, that's what you get. You know, these guys get paid that much because I think it's the return on capital, because capital is scarce. This other guy gets paid that because it's the inframarginal rent. Labor gets paid this and that, depending on labor supply, labor demand, demography, standard of living. They have various theories. And some of them go as far as saying that this is just, this is unjust. But when you look at what they talk about, what's just and what's unjust, it's all about who's adding value. So you get some guys that says, oh, only landowners should make money because land is the source of all value. So anything that landowners make money. Now, if you think when that's written, that's about 1700, right? And before the French Revolution. And then you think a moment, wait a second, am I wrong? Or they chopped off a bunch of dozens and dozens of heads a few decades later because those landowners were making, in the eyes of the people that chopped off their heads, a bit too much. But the economist talking about that had no concern at all. Now, I'm not saying the economist was wrong, the economist was right, the revolution were right, the revolution were wrong. That's not the issue. The issue is, did the classics concern themselves with economic inequality in the sense we mean it now? That is, that some people make a lot of money, some people make little? Absolutely not. They didn't give a damn. They made some observation, but the observation belonged to the same style that you find in Aristotle or in the old Scholastic, which is in some sense a different issue, which is the common human empathy that we prove. There are exceptions to this too, but most humans feel bad when they see very poor, starving people. There's no doubt. So, but in that case, what we feel is a sentiment of compassion, of self-identification, of empathy, as it is called, of sadness, because of poverty, because the human is suffering, because the person, the family, they're not eating well, they're in the cold, blah, blah, blah. They suffer. So we're not thinking what motivates us typically in general, what has motivated people all the time, as not being, oh, Caesar lives in the palace and the other guy lives in the out in the cold. It's the guy lives out in the cold. But this is not specific to economists and even less to classical economists. This you find, obviously, it's been the topic of religious discussion, moral discussion, and blah, blah, blah. For centuries, there's nothing specific that economics has ever said about it, other than what was the name of the Catalano, no? the famous common sense wisdom man of Arbore. It's better to be young, healthy, rich, and beautiful, and spend a weekend on a beautiful yacht with nice people under the sun than being old, sick, with fever and flu, and stay at home in a cold bedroom. Well, you're probably too young, but there used to be this night show in the early 80s, middle 80s. I remember having the friends sending the cassettes because it was very entertaining. Organized by this guy, Renzo Arbore, back around 84, 85. It was called Quelli della Notte. And they had a number of characters he had been finding in life. Some of them now would be so politically incorrect that they would never go on TV. And one of them was this, I think, Catalano, that sitting on a fancy sofa would come out with this completely silly platitudes about what's good, what's bad. But anyhow, he managed to do it in a way that he would laugh. So again, back to economic theory. Classical economists were concerned about income allocation among factors, among social classes. And the basic motivation quite clearly is to show that the price mechanism does a good job, or at least does a job that you can understand, follows certain rules, and therefore you can use it as an instrument for understanding what's going on. Okay. And this I already said before. The classic matter of fact, income inequality was natural. In fact, you don't have to, but it's very interesting to study a bit. I'm doing it again these days for other reasons. To study a bit the view that pre-Christian thinkers in general had of inequality. At least in the Western culture. I have to admit, I don't know enough of Eastern culture, Indian, Chinese in particular, to say anything about that. Even if the little I know say that in those cases, it was even more drastic and more extreme. But roughly until Christian times, more or less, and then it went in waves, the dominant culture worldwide was one that said we belong to different social groups, we have different social status, we play different roles. Some of us are very powerful, very few of us are very powerful and have everything they want, but there at least is physically possible at the time, and lots of others have little. Some of us have so little that we don't even have our lives because we're slaves or we're women or we're children. But the dominant view ideology was not an economic theory, okay? It was that this was just natural and just. Kings are kings. Women are women. Slaves are slaves and peasants are peasants. And you are that because so the gods want. And that's the way it should be, and that's the way it is, and just shut the fuck up or I'll kill you, basically. That was the conclusive argument before the QED at the end of the mathematical proof was shut the fuck up or I'll kill you. And that ended the proof. Okay, there was no much discussion. There were revolts were discussion, but then you would end up crucified on the Appiah's way, right? As we all know from the movies, but also from the facts. And actually, the actual crucifixion were worse, if you try to imagine them, than those we saw in the movies. So the movie from that point of view is less gruesome. So concerns for inequality is actually a product first of Christian thinking, but even in Christian thinking, it's very interesting. In the equality of humans is there, gets established, is universal, but it's in front of God. It has nothing to do with material condition. The material inequality of which we concern ourselves these days, it's really not there. The way in which Christian theology, from the very start, and for an incredibly long time, that's why Rerum Novarum is a novelty, and it came almost 2,000 years after, the way in which Christian theology has always addressed the issue of economic and social inequality in front of a claimed equality of our souls in front of God and the church has been through charity. It's almost never been through proposal of social reforms, proposal of modifying property rights, proposal of modifying political, economic rules, altering power, or things of this kind. And when it was in the form of heresies that got frequently punished, severely punished. I know, there's a bit of myth these days. It's been there for a few years. I guess Umberto Eco is responsible of the Qatars, right, of other utopian Christian communities here and there. But, let's forget the details, even if some of them make for fascinating reading. But the point is that they all have one thing in common. They all got wiped out. And the technique with which they got wiped out was the same one I gave before for proving the theorem. Shut the fuck up or I'll kill you. Oh, you didn't? Well, I'll kill you. Okay. So it's very interesting, in fact, that while the seed, in some sense, with the idea that all men should be treated equal and should live equally, right, are there in the Christian thinking. I have little doubt about this because I haven't been able to find similar statement in any other religion or ways of philosophizing, precedent or even contemporary. It's also interesting that the way in which the actual church and Christian religion and other religion, this is not, I'm not blaming the Christian religion. In fact, if anything, I'm saying at least in the Christian view of the world, the Christian ethics, there is a principle of equality. And it's actually this principle of equality is pushed farther, I have to say, by Protestants, because the Protestants say basically is not only we're equal, blah, 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 in front of God, as far as religious matters are concerned, we are also equal here on earth. There's no pope that has a phone line and a red line with the gods and knows exactly what the god says. There is no bishops that have to tell us what to think. The relation with the God is personal. We're equal. So, he apparently has decided to communicate with us through its son and some writings and some messages in the Testament, in the Bible. All right, we'll get together because he told us to get together. We pray, we sing, and we read his words and try to interpret, but then it's up between him and me. There's no much of a mediation. That's why Protestant churches at the end are essentially decentralized service companies, and they're not, they don't have the complicated bureaucratic pyramidal structure that the Catholic Church has, because there is equality. That's the whole point. It's equality. I mean, the pastor is just a guy or a woman that studied the matter and set up a service line that is, okay, I organize the church, I organize the lectures and the meeting. I mean, this is not irrelevant for understanding how we got to think at a certain point that we should also be economically equal. I think there are reasons to believe that the Protestant step was very important. The Christian step was very important, introducing the idea of equality of the soul. And the Protestant step was even a second movement forward. It said, well, we're also fairly equal in front of God, and therefore we are fairly equal in front of the law, and therefore the laws should treat us equally. And there you have what's called liberalism, which basically, they're not. It's a little bit more complicated, but basically for what concerns us, starts out with this idea, wait a second. If I'm equal to you in front of the Lord, and there is no Pope, and there is no special bishop that knows stuff that I don't know and tells me what to do, then if I'm equal to you in front of the law of God, why am I not equal to you in front of the law of the state? And that's a critical step, right? It's a critical step because in that way, everybody has the same property rights, basically. Have the same, has to be treated equally by the law, and therefore everybody can participate in those activities that the law regulates. And those activities are the political activity, voting, and the market activities, intended in the broadest sense. And once you say, well, if everybody is equal in front of the law, everybody has the same right, and everybody can participate in the market activity, why are there so different outcomes? You can't ask why are there different outcomes when you assume that my status as a marquis that own 100,000 hectares of land is natural. For the same reason, you don't ask why the horse runs faster than me. It's got 4 legs, huge muscles. That's why it runs faster than me. So the marquis has a lot of castles and land and women and dresses because he's the marquis, and I'm just the son of a bitch. In fact, he made my mother a bitch because he's the marquis, and he rightly did so because that's the way it is. Don't laugh. That was a good joke. Jokes are useful. They release tension and they actually reveal aspect of reality. No, I'm serious. You see, that's then you have to have the logical step. Then the logical step of economic inequality comes out. There is nothing natural in the fact that you're Rockefeller. Why are you Rockefeller and not me? Given that we have similar legal rights and we both play the market. So that's why I think this is a theme of this course. I've always said, economists and social scientists in general have not been studying always the same reality. The reality has changed. Physicists are lucky. They've always been looking at the same damn universe. We've been looking at a changing socioeconomic reality, and we've been looking at it with different filters, with different moral filters, with different hypotheses. Right now, we work down from the hypothesis that people have equal legal rights. Thomas or Aristotle or even Davanzati did not look at reality assuming that everybody had the same equal rights. That's the problem. So they obviously did not ask certain questions because those questions just were impossible within the set of axioms they use. At the end, I mean, that's to make it to make this an enormously long story very short. But inequality is in the sense of why are we unequal in the sense of some are rich, some are poor, is basically set by Marx. The classical, as I said, have very little concern with that. The classical thing, well, workers get their wage and landowners get the rent and people, the land capital get interest or profits and entrepreneurs get profit. Then they debate if there is a difference between interest and profits, if it is return on capital or not return on capital, if there is some particular kind of skill you're rewarding and how high or low it should be. But they're not much concerned with what today we perceive as inequality. That is the notion that it's unjust, that you get a lot and I get a little. And the first one that puts it explicitly and try to model that more or less analytically in that way is Marx. And Marx says, this is the artifact. That's the point. This is the artifact. It's not natural. It's an artifact. And it's an artifact of human laws, of human institution, of the mode of production, as since him, people started to say. It's due to private property. And I say, oh, Boldrin, wait a second, lots of people fought against private property. There were communist communities here and there, especially in the countryside. Yeah, sure. But there was no economic theory behind that. And let's forget about the fact that they were regularly a failure and blah, blah, blah. The various forms of communitarism had typically religious motives and were not very articulated, even those that lasted a bit. Marx makes it a piece of economic theory. He says, well, if I abolish private property and I change the system of property rights, people will have different incentives, and those incentives will be better. That's basically his argument. Private property gives wrong incentives. Private property gives the incentive of making profits, and making profits is bad with all the consequences, I know. So that's his answer. So the first theory true theory of modern economic inequality that makes sense is Marx. No doubt about it. Absolutely no doubt. Again, you can find here and there references, examples, things that may make you think. I mean, some of those Marx, in fact, criticized, but, he's the first that has a very clear picture of the whole thing and tries to set it up analytically. Forget about the fact that, in other moments I argued that, it's incoherent internally. It's okay, it is, but it is an effort to make a model. And he says the problem is private property. So he's pointing in modern language, if Sandro Brusco was here, he points out to a mechanism. Private property is a mechanism. It's an allocation mechanism. And he says, the allocation that comes out is not efficient. So why, in fact, among theorists, the welfare theorems are relevant, and why proofs of efficiency or lack of efficiency of this or the other allocation that obtain under a mechanism or not are relevant for theorists. Because Marx's argument is an argument of efficiency, even before being an argument of social justice. Remember, Marx wants to be scientific, and he says, there is an efficiency problem here. This thing will bring to a collapse. This thing is not good. It's not efficient. It will waste resources. It leads to overcapitalization, overproduction, underproduction, lack of, it leads to something that is socially inefficient. He tries very hard not to be a moralist. Then he ends up being a moralist or a polemist because he earns a lot of money. Well, no, he doesn't earn a lot of money. That's something. He earns his living by writing beautiful articles as a polemist, and obviously a polemist that has to write on the newspaper and agitate his readers is not going to be writing very dry, scientific, cynic things. He has to write with strong tones and incite people to revolt. You should read him, actually. He's very enjoyable. So the guy writes. I mean, Travaglio imitates him, but Marx is a lot better. A lot more amusing and lyrical. Okay. So that's one view. Marx's view is it's private property. The mechanism is wrong. The mechanism yields the inefficient allocation, and that provides the wrong incentive. And so all the thing I told you about Lindahl, equilibrium, are all talking about this. They're all discussion, in fact, about income inequality dressed in this technical form. The second answer is Varra. And then, frankly, there are no other answers. Varra, and actually Varra is a lot less explicit than this, but I put Varra because in some sense is the first to present an explicit model where people have endowment. It says, look, it's a consequence, given the market mechanism, of the fact that people are different. Notice that in my phrase, I say it's a consequence, given the market mechanism, that people are different. Because there is a recognition in that line of thought that with different mechanisms, you may not have the type of economic inequality we have with this mechanism. But there is the presumption that some form of market mechanism is more efficient than others, and therefore you use at the social level market mechanism to allocate resources. And then you notice that as a consequence of this mechanism, and on the fact that people are heterogeneous in their endowments, you get unequal outcomes. So in some sense, Varra is Marx with two variations. One is stressing, yes, all men may be born equal, legally speaking, but they're certainly not equal in terms of endowments. They're incredibly heterogeneous. And two, the market mechanism is not even remotely the only reason for inequality. The market mechanism is a relatively efficient way of allocating resources, and inequality comes from the fact that the people are heterogeneous. Okay. Now, obviously, at this point, everything becomes a bit trickier for me, because I do think that, well, I think that after 8 weeks, you're aware that I'm a big admirer of Marx. On this one, he got it completely wrong. I'm wrong as a matter of fact, not as a matter of theory of passion, just wrong. In particular, the idea that that the level in which and the extent to which we are different matters very little for final outcomes, and that the final outcomes of inequality is mostly determined by private property and the market mechanism. I have a very hard time following. In fact, I have a very hard time understanding how people keep following that line of thinking in front of historical evidence. And so now my lecture becomes biased, but there's nothing I can do. This does not mean the mechanisms don't matter. Mechanisms do matter. But there is one thing that seems to me out of question in human history, and it is inequality has always been there. And that's where one has to start from. So if I want to try to understand inequality, I need to start from the facts. You see what I mean? I need to start from the facts. And the research has started very little from the fact, because it has been colored with politics from the start, because there was this bisection. It's all private property fault. Oh, no, it's natural because we are heterogeneous. God, I feel so middle of the road democratic Christian in this lecture. So I stand in the middle, but it is true, because both positions are a bit ideological, honestly. I mean, it's patently true that private property, well, in some sense, Marx is right, but it's a truism. So let's start from there, right? Because I want to spend 10 minutes on history before going on to current research. Maybe 15 minutes, what is it? We have another 45 minutes, about 40 minutes, yeah. So let's think about private property. See, I brought here this book. In case you're curious, read it. It's very famous. Marshall Salin's Stone Age Economics. I guess it's translated also in Italian. Let me check. I bet it is. Yeah, it's translated as literally L'economia dell'età della pietra. You can find it in Kindle version on Amazon. It costs $12. So maybe, I don't know. And it seems published by, who's this? I can't see who's the editor. Anyhow, it's not that I want you to read it, just if you're curious. The book is very famous. It's a very old book. It was written about 40 years ago, I think. Yeah, first edition is 1972, so exactly 40 years ago. What's the point of, why is the book significant? Because there is a very long and very strong current in the social science that says private property is somewhat artificial. There's nothing natural about it. Okay. Now, what does natural mean? I mean, per se, private property or any, none of these things can be natural. I mean, private property is something that we define with laws, and even the notion of property is extremely variable according to legislation, right? I mean, the fact that there are rights that other people have, and so that owning something is never complete. You never own anything completely until you eat it. Even then, they can open up your stomach, okay? But you know, in a generic terms, we say private property is natural in the sense that we think that people will tend to have some form of private property. And we observe the fact that all social organizations have had one form or another of private property. The point of this book and many other is that if you go back long enough, you go back basically to the hunter-gatherers, to Stone Age, then there is a way of reading that evidence that says these people were basically communists. They did not have private property, or they had it in an extremely small amount. They didn't produce, they didn't suffer of the disease of wanting more. A large chunk of the book is dedicated to prove that hunter-gatherer tribes underproduce. That is, they don't try to maximize payoff. There is a reply, technical reply that says, yeah, obviously they don't, because they don't want to exploit the land and overgraze, and because the key thing is insurance. But here we get into Bob Townsend's initial work was on this and was very interested to show, in fact, how these are essentially insurance mechanisms. But there is a literature that says private property came up at a certain point. It's related to a literature that says private property comes together with males' domination on females. There was a matriarchal world once upon a time. There was a bit like the Garden of Eden. And again, if you're interested to pursue this line of thought, which in my opinion is completely baloney and ignores facts very happily, even if great minds have tried to make it stick, you got to start from Engels. The origin of the state, of the family, and private property. In fact, Engels point out, and in some sense, they're not Marxist, they're Engelsian. Engels felt that because of Marx, private property is perceived as unnatural and the source of all problems. And because, on the other hand, Marx himself points out that at the end, the market mechanism and the private generalized form of private property not justified by the sword, but by pure legal means and market means, is an innovation and is mechanism that is greatly superior to the previous one. We call it medieval, but it's essentially the mechanism for which ownership and accumulation takes place through violence and expropriation more than through buying and selling and producing. And this seems to apply all the way back. Marx is well read, so he talks about the antique mode of production and the oriental mode of production, and is quite aware that they all have some form or another of private property. What changes is just the way private property is justified. This is my personal interpretation that Engels did it for that. But yes, I do think he did it for that. Engels felt that the argument would have been the argument against private property in the market economy would have been utterly limited or incoherent if one did not make an effort to show that indeed humans can live in a world where there is no private property, and in that world they live better. You see, that's a logical step, because if you say, look, yes, for the 5,000 years, 7,000 years, 10,000 years, 11,000 years, because you can go back to any archaeological evidence of the first agricultural communities and you find the same inequality structure. If so, for the 15,000 years I can go back, I find not only private property, but various forms of inequality persistently appearing. There must be a moment in which things go wrong. And so now there is, I have to, it's a very interesting, because I keep reading them, they keep convincing me less and less, because it's incredibly distorted the reading of facts that comes out in this literature. But you should read it yourself. There is a vast literature, especially in anthropology, that says humans were originally communist. Then things all of a sudden got wrong. And they got wrong when tribes established themselves as sedentary, essentially the Neolithic transition, and for whatever reason decided to create stable communities, villages. This allowed accumulation and blah, blah, blah. And this created the family, the authority of the male over the female, the state, blah, blah, blah. Now, there is no doubt that religion, state, and accumulation must be coextensive, at least along the time dimension, with settlements. And moving tribes, by definition, cannot carry too much. You cannot own much if you're a gypsy. Even gypsies, though, prefer Mercedes to Fiat, as you well know. Something that people should think about. Yes, the gypsies live out of little they own, the rest they take care by stealing, but no, it's not a prejudice, it's a fact. You can sue me if you want, but it happens to be a fact. It's part of a culture, and I don't have a particular problem. I just be careful when I meet them on Paseo del Prado with their rosmarine and says, no, thank you, I don't need you to read my hand and get my wallet. I'll be fine without having my future told by you, but you're very nice and very nicely. I find them enjoyable. What I recommend, if you go to Sevilla, to hang around the what's the name of the barrio al sur del Guadalquivir? Triana. Triana is very interesting, and you eat very well, and it's a lot of fun, and flamenco is very good. But part of the living light of the gypsies has to do with the fact that their private property is their private property and the other is debatable. And it's up to, but nevertheless, I repeat, they prefer huge Mercedes to small Cinquecento. So that's the line of literature. And the line of literature says there used to be a marvelous communist past. In fact, there is a part of literature that tend to show, and it's interesting because there some of the data are correct. There are reasons to claim that from the point of view of food, quality of the diet, and some diseases, the hunter-gatherer was better off than the farmer, than the first farmers. And there is evidence suggesting that life expectancy certainly did not go up in the transition from hunter-gathering to farming, and quite possibly went down on a number of dimensions. And then the question becomes, why did they do so? If that made them worse off? I don't have an answer, but it seems to me intuitively that if they all did so, there must have been other things that compensated. For example, the fatigue and the riskiness of moving around continuously, or being exposed to changing weather and other kind of risk to animals was bad. Maybe the feeling of, yes, I might live a bit longer, but I might be eaten tomorrow by a lion, makes your life more miserable than, yes, I might end up eating a little bit less and therefore dying a couple of years earlier, but I'll die in bed and I'm not going to be eaten alive by a lion. And that compensates. Risk and return, basically. Because we have observed that pretty much almost everywhere where it was possible and became feasible, people did do the transition. In any case, if you're interested to pursue this line of literature, I've given you enough information. And so that's a way of looking at private property as the source of inequality, and there is a way of avoiding it by going back to the hunter-gatherers. The Yanomano are there in the Amazon forest near the southern of Venezuela waiting for you. Watch out. They're not very friendly, but now they've learned to understand that there are people that come from outside different from them with airplanes. So if you parachute yourself and bring a lot of good stuff, they might take you for your communist experience. All right, and please send postcards. So that's one view. The other view is this. You see, today I came with books for you, so you can read something. There are many others, but you don't read even what I assign, so I'm not gonna suggest you many books. So Scheidel, who's actually also a leftist, but he's a rational leftist, as opposed to a poetic leftist, says, look, Scheidel is a very famous historian, has written major work on the economic history of the ancient world. I think I have some of his technical work back here, if I moved. No, I moved it. Where did I put it? And so this is a more popular book. It's a simple book that even if you're not a specialist, you can read. It's very well written. It's very long. Scheidel writes a lot. He has another one, if you want to read, which is also related, very fascinating. It's called Escape from Rome. You may want to have your parents give you a gift, or your girlfriend or boyfriend give you a gift for Christmas. Escape from Rome is kind of entertaining. What is the Scheidel says? Scheidel says, hey, look, I'm sorry. Inequality has always been there. Not only, let me tell you, if I take the very long run perspective, it's a book about pretty much the history of the world, even if it focuses on more recent centuries and Western side, but there's quite a bit of graphs and stuff. Things like this. But it's very readable. It should be, I think they're all translated in Italian. You don't have to, let's check. Walter Scheidel. I actually kept calling him Scheidel, and then a friend of yours, the other day I was talking about something else and said, oh no, it's Scheidel, thank you. Wait, I'm in English, translate, okay, no, in Italian, let me see, Italian translation. Oh, porca loca. Everything in English. Okay, so this one has been translated. La Grande Livelatrice was translated and it's published in Italian by Mulino. Okay, so this you can, I don't know if Fuga da Roma has been translated. Doesn't look like. No, Fuga Roma is more entertaining. So what's the point of Scheidel? The point of Scheidel is inequality has always been there. It's unavoidable. We have seen it in every society. And here is the bad news, which I will mention at the end. It seems to be growing in every epoch, in every society with income. Periods of great societal development are periods in which economic inequality grows. When a country, an empire, a state, a population, a tribe does well, within that tribe, some people do a lot better than others. So the message is very Reagan. A rising tide lifts all boats, but lifts some more than others. The second part was not in Reagan. It's in Scheidel. And the other observation, which is why this has that title, a livella, I think they should have translated in Italy like that, a livella, is that it says there are 4 ways historically through which we have actually accomplished a long-lasting reduction of economic inequality, where long-lasting means more than a few years, more than a few decades. And it's been big wars, health calamities, destruction, and running out of literally the collapse of society. This has to do with old civilization. That is, if you want to get equality coming, or if you want to reduce inequality, because you're not going to get equality, also shows nature, you better bring about destruction of one form or another. Now, actually, I should say that even this rule has just been contradicted. Because for the little I've observed in the data, it's a bit early, but this pandemic has actually increased inequality, not decreased it. Because everything that has been done in terms of policy has protected the well-off and exposed the worse-off, has made the worse-off worse, has made them unable to work. And while some of them may have benefited by subsidies, most of them have not. Certainly at the world level, this has been a factor that has dramatically increased inequality. So even that law by Scheidel seemed to have been violated, but there are no, historical laws are not mathematical laws. They tend to say, well, in a large percentage of cases, this is the case. And in fact, people criticize, there is a literature now on the Scheidel argument that if you're interested, you should look. So we can go here. Saying, well, if we look at what happened in the last 200 years, we've actually managed to reduce inequality. Which brings us to this part, right? What has been the discussion then since Varra and Marx? The discussion since Varra and Marx has been, then there are 2 ways to reduce inequality. One is to reduce the difference in endowments, and the other is to reduce the extent of private property, to limit private property. So whenever you look at the debates on which measures should be taken or should not be taken, what's good, what's bad, what is the cause or is not the cause of economic inequality, you will see that people tend to go, well, it is because this and the other consequence of private property is creating this distortion, so we should limit private property on that side. For example, I said it myself. One of the reasons I think intellectual property is damaging, something that I probably should have stressed more when we wrote about this 20 years ago, is that intellectual property artificially, and here you see I use artificially, so I'm a standard economist, I'm not doing things particularly original. Why do I say artificially it increases income inequality? because I think that an allocation without intellectual property, or with very limited intellectual property, is Pareto superior to one with. I mean, the bulk of the work with David is to show, both with data and with models, that innovation takes place equally or more with very limited intellectual property, and that the allocation of resources for innovation that obtains with limited intellectual property or zero intellectual property is better and it's superior than the one you obtain with. So you see, Marx was not different from us or other, and I think we haven't talked about this during the course. I think it's a reasonable way of looking at it. If I have to talk about an aggregate mechanism and a rule the society has to follow, I better ask a question from the point of view of Pareto. I don't see any other way. Then I can, in a second step, I can take a stance. I can say, look, it is or it is not Pareto superior, or almost Pareto superior. But on the other hand, because I think for political reason, then the interest of this social group should dominate on the interest of that social group, then I advocate this and that. That's nothing wrong with that. All you have to do is to make it explicit. In any case, the argument we make is intellectual property is behind a lot of raising income inequality. And I think evidence is incredibly strong, from the electronic digital economy to the arts and entertainment and sport and so on. It's not obviously the only cause, but it's a huge factor in explaining that increase in that 0.1% or 0.01% of income and wealth distribution. So that's one way, you want to alter the rules of the game. You want to change the mechanism, okay? And the other is that you want to change the endowment. What is that I mean with changing the endowment? This may seem very less clear, but there's a lot of do-goodies. If you want, it's the rerum novarum approach. Charity belongs to changing the endowment. You transfer a little bit of your endowment to the poor. But more seriously, when people said we have to expropriate land, the latifond, the uncultivated land, right, and redistribute it to farmers, they didn't say private property is bad. They just said the endowment is allocated in a crazy way. It's not efficient because these guys don't cultivate the land. And it's also unjust because it keeps hundreds of thousands of people in poverty, unable to use their work and their labor because they don't own the other input of production. And this is keeping the country behind. So all the advocates of land reform, if you read, yes, there is, if you want, the extreme version. Oh, let's do communism on the land. Let's expropriate the land, redistribute equal, and then do commune, the Chinese or Russian way. But the communes failed. That's something that should be learned, right? Think about it. There are all this feudal land, okay, you expropriate. And then you can go two ways. You make it commune property, and you get the great leap forwards, and you get 50 million people dying of famine. Or you can do land redistribution, in which you give farmers a decent piece of land proportional to their ability to farm it, and you see what happens. While in the second case, there's been a lot of circumstances in which things were done wrong. In particular, land was redistributed, but they did not redistribute at all, even the elementary amount of wealth, so that farmer, even to buy seed, had to go immediately to the old landowner, and the landowner would say, yeah, I'll give you the seed, but you give me back the land, and that was the end of it. Okay, but on average, that kind of land redistribution that kept private property and went for the efficient redistribution of the endowments did a lot better than the communes. Communes have been failing all over the world, not only in China, but also in Russia, right? Dramatically for a long time. But the thing to understand is that those were instruments for changing the endowments. So we're cooperatives. Cooperatives are not about being against private property. A cooperative is private property. It's just the private property organized with a mechanism, that internal mechanisms that tend to solve the endowment problem, the private information about endowment, differently, right? In a cooperative, there is a bunch of people with different skills, different abilities, therefore different endowments. I can organize them in a vertical way where I put Alessandro on the top, and Alessandro calls the shots and says, no, you didn't do right. I fire you, right? I don't pay you. And so on. Or I can put everybody on the same table and decide more or less by majority voting if I did the right job or not, if I have to do the job that Umberto does, if Arianna has to replace Diego, if Diego did better than Filippo, and so on. So there are, the cooperatives are forms of management of, just a second, give me a second, because I think I'm waiting for something important and I think they knocked on the door. Just give me a second. Coming. Here I am. Sorry. And so on. So different forms of shareholding. Nationalization is another way of changing the endowments. And in particular, the last two, which are today very fashionable, people talk a lot about. If you look honestly at today's factors in income inequality growth, I didn't show you the data. If you want, we can look at some data when we meet next week for question. But if you look, you realize that the simple fashionable view of capital versus labor is just nonsense. In fact, capital versus labor explain very little. Capitalization of certain kind of human capital explain a lot of the wealth inequality. But it's a lot different from saying capital. You see, if you think at why Bezos is worth what he's worth and Tesla is worth, oh, sorry, Daniel, you had a question. I haven't seen it. After an allocation of the land, how I can measure if the inequality is decreasing? Well, you measure if income inequality decreases, if wealth inequality decreases. That's the way you do it, right? Where is Daniel? He's disappeared. Oh, there he is. That's one way of looking at it, right? So we have seen it very successful in many places, certainly most of Northern Europe, certainly. All right, so for example, in the Americas, it's a bit complicated to decide because the land was taken from the native people. So, but it's true that they, modulo that then they redistributed equally. And that created a very equal society. So United States of America controlling, if you ignore the fact that the native people had lost almost everything, as many economic historians pointed out, was an incredibly equal society in the middle of the second half of the 19th century. In spite of all the blah, blah, any measure of income inequality around 1860, 1870 in the United States is very low. And might have been, among large societies, the most equal that has ever existed. So there is a certain amount of research on that is quite convincing, okay? But obviously there is the part that the land was taken away from the so-called Indian or, native tribes. And so obviously there was a big loser on the other side. So it becomes a complicated argument. The same was true for Argentina, but Argentina was immediately less equal because Argentinian did the same thing. Argentina, in fact, did the same thing even more brutally. You have to learn that Argentina wiped out the Indians completely. They literally made sure that the last one was either gone to Chile or killed. And then what they were following was a less liberal method, and therefore the landowner were grabbing much bigger pieces of land. There was no central planner allocation of chunks of land. Have you ever read about the Oklahoma Rush, the Oklahoma Run? Well, Tex Willer has a sequence of three fumetti in the last few months. They're pretending that Tex is part of the Oklahoma, but it was a land assignment. And the land assignment had this form, will give equal plots. Obviously, there were, Ricardo, good plots and bad plots. They were roughly on equal size, but some were better than the other because of location, okay? And the way we assign it is with a run. At a certain date, you start with your cart and you just run for days until you get to where the plots are being assigned. You plant your flag and you say, that's me, and you get it. Created a bit of violence, so it created inequality right away because those that could run faster got there, the most violent got there, the well-organized got there first, blah, blah, blah. But you see, this inequality problem is a bitch. Anyhow, these days, we recognize that a lot of inequalities seem to follow from human capital inequality. Right? That's the thing I would say with Bezos. Yeah, Bezos now is a big capitalist. That the capitalism of Bezos is obtained not from having capital, but by capitalizing his human capital and the huge bets he took. Same is true for the people of Google. Same is true for a lot of things these days. These people just capitalize a difference between their human capital and skill and yours and mine and that of their competitors. And it's a mechanism that is, in some sense, it seems to tell you that there is a component of truth in the old idea that labor is the source of any value, because at the end is the skilled labor of Sergey and Larry that did Google, that wrote the code. And without that to leverage, you would have gone nowhere. Right? The old monster called Google that is listening to me in this moment. Hi, Google, listen to me? Yes. Hi, Google, play some music. He doesn't want to play music. What happened? Did I turn it off? What an embarrassing scene. I was supposed to play music on my command. Is nothing but human capital capitalized. Hence the idea that we will overcome inequality by extending public education, sending everybody to school and training. And very honestly, I actually think that that's the only thing we can do, even if equally honestly, I don't think we will solve much, but hey, something is better than nothing. These are all processes for changing endowments. On the other hand, to reduce private property these days, we seem to have decided that the best way to go is to tax. And now this is, I could go on 2 classes on this, but I'll do it very briefly. Just think about let me give you a paradox. The average shop owner the average artisan, the average self-employed person in Southern Italy makes very little money. They don't make a lot of money. Some of them even get the reddito di cittadinanza. The reason they don't make a lot of money is the following. They have very low human capital. The mechanism, that is the rules of the game, allow fevers, support the persistence and the usage of incredibly inferior technologies, very low productivity technologies, so that their value added per unit of hour is extremely low. And we try to reduce the inequality effect that this generates by fiscal means, because we allow them to practice fiscal evasion, and then we give them reddito di cittadinanza. We give them transfer. Totally backward. Totally backward. But if you want to try to understand a huge dimension of relative poverty in Italy, or low income, low productivity, you better look at it this way. That's given that you live in Italy. In other countries, Spain is not so dissimilar. There are other countries where there are different issues, but it's very interesting that we decide that we use the fiscal leverage to attenuate the fact that for a complicated set of political and ideological reasons, we don't want to modify the mechanism, the underlying mechanisms that support adoption of bad technologies as opposed to adoption of good technologies, where good versus bad is more productive, less productive. So let's finish with 2 laws. Boldrin law of inequality. The level of inequality is driven by the productivity of the scarcest essential factor in the most productive technology. The scarcest essential factor today is being very smart at writing code. That's why Larry Brain is so rich.
Prof, one question. So the tax on heritage, that's within the reduction of private property.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Tax on inheritance. Reduction of endowment, right? So, Larry Page, probably, I don't know his bill, but I don't know how much money the parents has. He managed to go to where? Stanford, and then I don't know. Anyway, so the MIT, whatever. So the point is, it's for the son, for the daughter, is an endowment debt, right?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. It's a modification of endowment through a reduction of private property.
Okay.
This is true also, it's true also for the land, right? What's the difference? It's the same thing. Right? I got the land because I am Marchese di Salaparuta, or whatever it's called, right? Conte de Brageonte, as my mother used to say, all right? And I have all this land. The reason you're doing the expropriation is not because in first place, and honestly, this was the reason, you think that I am a bad guy, I should not have that land, but because you say that's poorly allocated. What the hell are you doing with all that land? You don't cultivate it. So let me take it away and redistribute so that I give people endowment so they can work. If you think of the crazy proposal that in Italy some party came up with, which is let's do a inheritance tax on the very rich, so that we give, what is it they wanted to give? 10,000 euros, 5,000 euros, 3,000 euros?
10,000, I think.
Right. Endowment at birth to every young person, to every new birth, has the same logic. The logic is, they're not going to do anything with the billions or with the 100 millions or the tens of millions they inherit from their parents. Hence, let me redistribute the endowment in a more efficient way. So I give $10,000 to Daniel when he's born, so that when he turns 14, he can buy some canne without bothering too much. Sorry, Daniel, or Michele for that matter. Let's give it to Michele so Daniel doesn't take it personally. He's a sport guy. But anyhow, yes, obviously the two means overlap. I agree. If that's your observation. I'm trying to show the motivations, but I agree that they overlap. Anyhow, I'll let you think about this law and Scheidel. Scheidel law already spoiled it. Scheidel law says the level of inequality increases with income. In other words, mean and standard deviation of income distribution are positively correlated. This has to do with the example I gave you. If you look at who makes money for real, you realize that it's the essentiality of the scarce factor that gives you all this market power. There is a randomness component, but that's when you average out over the randomness, that's what you find. All right. That for me does it. I mean, we could go on for a long time, but I guess that's plenty of materials to think about. And you know, you can always find me, send me messages, blah, blah, blah. Filippo, you have a question?
Excuse me. About the debate to reduce the poverty from like changing endowments or reducing private property. Does this debate stem from the debate between John Stuart Mill and like about the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and Marx about changing first like the social endowments or the economic endowments of people to increase people's wealth and to reduce inequality?
Yeah, it's something very similar, right? Right. Marx was saying it's private property, and Mill was, in some sense, well, without some sense, Mill was one of the many that fought along Benthamite lines, right? There is an argument, there is a classically liberal argument, if you want, for income redistribution that has to do with utility, literally, right? Here we go on other issues, but there is a view, for those that don't know, that says, well, you know, if the aim of social policy is to maximize total utility, and again, we treat everybody equally, so everybody has the same weights, then if marginal utility is decreasing, we should have absolute equality, because that's what you get by maximizing utility function, by maximizing aggregate utility as the sum of individual utility function. But this obviously brings, I mean, first of all, it's a silly way, in my opinion, to put the problem, but this requires another discussion. But even within that frame of mind, within that way of thinking, there is a problem. It assumes that utility functions are identical, which they're not. Okay, and second, it also assume, and that's the eternal problem of any socialization process, that the size of the pie has nothing to do with the way we split it. Now, I understand this is an old story. I understand this sounds very conservative. I understand that, oh my God, you can't be so ignorant. Well, I am that ignorant. But I'm willing to learn. If anybody is ever want to show me how we can actually manage to find an efficient, stable, and acceptable mechanism that makes the size of the pie independent from the way we split it, I don't know. I'm going to start writing again to Stockholm and propose that person for the Nobel Prize for the rest of my days. This I didn't want to address. It's the old debate, but I think it's still the eternal debate. The size of the pie is not in. Do you understand the metaphor, right? Mechanism,
please.
The size of the pie, the term is determined, among other things, by the way we split the pie. In other words, distributional mechanism provide incentive for production, investment, work, innovation, and so on. Separating one from the other has been the dream of economists all along. Economists, from this point of view, have been fascinated with socialism for a long time. I mean, true right-wing people don't like mathematical economists. Let me tell you something. They used to be called mandarins. Okay, the true right-wing always thought economists were their enemies. Because there is an approach which at a certain point becomes very naive, and I also find it deleterious because it doesn't address the other problem, the problem of political power. But there is also a good aspect that the economists ask themselves, is there a way of maximizing the pie independently from the way we split it? Or is there a way of separating? I mean, think of the old theory about second welfare theorem and Pareto transfer. What is it about? It's about a tentative of saying, okay, I give you prices. I assign prices, and I assign prices so right that given the market mechanism, you maximize the size of the pie. Right? Simultaneously and independently from the prices and the action you take, I take lump sum transfer from your wealth. That's the way the implementation of the second welfare theorem works. Now we're getting a bit technical, right? But this thing achieves ideally exactly that ideal. With the correct prices, I maximize the pie. With a lump sum transfer, I redistribute without affecting incentive. It doesn't work. People talk about Hayek here, neoliberal. No. Hayek was right on this point, was not the only one. This was a point clear to a variety of people, but he became more famous because he wrote it very clearly. He said, you can't do that because you have an informational problem. You don't damn know the reason that people work. You don't know their endowment, their private information. And essentially he said, Lindahl, Jesus, is one of you guys, but he understands the problem. Lindahl. You see? It's called private information. It goes around. So that is, that's a fairly, in my opinion, unresolvable problem. Unresolvable in the sense you can't have your cake and eat it too, again, as the Americans say. And speaking of cake, I kiss you goodbye because it's 7:05 and I had an appointment 5 minutes ago. See you next Thursday.
Thank you. See you next time.
Bye.
Take care,
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Ciao, ragazzi. Bye-bye.